France has been a republic for more than a century, but once her kings and queens were the most powerful in the world. The pride and joy of the French Republic, the Palace of Versailles, where her former kings and queens once lived in unmatched splendor.
Nearly 400 years ago, the kings of France owned a hunting lodge 15 miles from Paris. 100 years later, it became the Palace of Versailles, the grandest palace in all Europe. The last Queen of France to live here was Marie Antoinette, who came here as a bride when she was only 14.
Well, when I first came here to try to discover what Marie Antoinette was really like, it was all rather difficult. From the very first, courtiers flattered her, enemies criticized her, so the truth is rather hard to find. But from the very first moment she set foot in France, she lived a huge part of her life in public, taking part in the endless ritual of royalty.
On April the 21st, 1770, the young princess began her journey to Versailles. It was to be the last time she would ever see her homeland and Vienna, the city of her birth. She had to travel halfway across Europe, and the journey took 3.5 weeks. The 57 carriages in the bridal procession were drawn by over 350 horses, which had to be changed 5 times a day. Roads were swept, cleared, even built for the young bride, and they were lined with cheering crowds who turned out to wish her well. At last, she arrived at the Palace of Versailles. This was to be her new home, where she was to live for the next 19 years. Versailles had been built a century earlier by her bridegroom's ancestor, Louis XIV, who was called the Sun King. Quite simply, he'd wanted to build the largest and grandest palace in the world. The Palace of Versailles held the entire royal family, almost all the nobility of France, all the ambassadors from foreign courts, the ministers of state, and countless officials. There were 4,000 servants to wait on them, and 2,000 horses in the stables, and the upkeep of it all soaked up 1/6 of the entire national income of France. Louis XIV had planned it all, and laid down the protocol that controlled every moment of life and behavior in the palace, rules that were still in existence as Marie Antoinette arrived. 2 days later, in the chapel of the palace, the young couple were married.
Maria Antonia of Austria was to become Marie Antoinette of France, and this marriage was to herald a new age of peace in Europe. The Austrian princess was to marry the grandson and heir of Louis XV of France.
Oui.
Marie was a Habsburg, Louis a Bourbon. Their families had been rivals for centuries.
Oui.
Au nom du Père, et du Fils, et du Saint-Esprit. Amen.
Out of the vast court, the bride was aware only of a handful of strangers who would shape her new life. Louis, her bridegroom, a year older than his Austrian bride, was himself a complete stranger.
Sic nomen benedictum.
The bridegroom's grandfather, King Louis XV, now 60 years old, had always been fascinated by women. Madame du Barry, his latest favorite, was installed at court, and Marie Antoinette soon learned she was someone to be reckoned with. The king's 3 unmarried daughters, her husband's aunts, waited to welcome their new niece into the family. The Comtesse de Noailles, her new lady-in-waiting, stood ready to initiate the new bride into the ways of Versailles. And the Comte de Mercy watched every move she made. He was the ambassador from her mother, the Empress in Vienna, to the King of France. So far, Marie Antoinette scarcely knew any of them, but already she guessed that her future happiness would depend on them all. The happy bride was called on to sign the register with all her names in French. Maria Antonia was to become Marie Antoinette forever. Her hand trembled, and she made a blot. An unhappy omen, the court said, or afterwards said they had said.
The firework display in the park had to wait for 2 days because there was a storm on the wedding night. But then it was magnificent. Nearly 50,000 rockets were fired and over 200,000 people attended. All France had the highest hopes for the marriage. The first task for the young bride was to learn all the rules and patterns of behavior that governed Versailles. The Comtesse de Noailles, a combined lady-in-waiting and governess, told her what to do on every occasion. Ladies did not run, they let their feet glide. She must never ask her lady-in-waiting to sit down. Only a duchess could sit in her presence on a backless stool. The Dauphine teased her and gave her a nickname.
Madame Etiquette.
When the 15-year-old princess wanted to go horse riding, she was told it was impossible. It was too dangerous.
Il est hors de question que vous montiez à cheval, ça pourrait être très dangereux.
Oh, madame.
Nous pourrions peut-être nous arranger pour que...
Perhaps a donkey might be allowed. When she fell off, she informed her attendants that if they wished to know the correct way to pick up a dauphine who had fallen off a donkey, they must send for Madame Etiquette.
Il faut demander Madame Etiquette. Elle nous montrera comment on doit relever la dauphine tombée de son âne.
The courtiers called Versailles this country of ours, and in early days it must have seemed a very foreign country to marry. She cherished every reminder of her carefree childhood. She was always surrounded by grown-ups, and the only escape that was approved of was playing cards with her 3 unmarried aunts.
I do so hate being bored.
Her mother, the Empress of Austria, kept warning her of all the pitfalls.
Do not forget your mother. Though I am far away, I will continue to watch over you until my last breath. I am afraid you may sometimes be backward saying your prayers. I urge you to read and study. Reading is all you are capable of, and you need it more than other girls, because you really know very little about music or drawing or other accomplishments.
Really, Maman, you write as if I were just an animal.
Let me urge you as my ambassador to keep a watchful eye upon my daughter. I'm afraid for her. She is so young. I fear the effect that flattery may have upon her, her idleness and her lack of any inclination for serious activity. I have every confidence in you.
I have made sure of 3 persons in the service of the Dauphine, 2 of her menservants and 1 of her women, who give me full reports of what goes on. I have sources of information as to what occurs whenever she sees the Dauphin.
Et je suis certain qu'il est sincère, qu'il soupçonnait plus d'une personne.
Sérieusement?
Sérieusement.
Superadded are my personal observations, so that really there is not an hour of the day when I am not told what the Dauphine may have said or done.
Louis loved the open air, and he had one great escape from the stuffiness of the palace. He also had a hobby that absorbed him for hours on end. mending locks and clocks. His young wife felt they had little in common.
My tastes are not the same as his. He enjoys only hunting and working with tools.
Marie Antoinette began to enjoy her new rank and was contented enough, especially when she could escape from the hated court etiquette. Gradually, she and Louis began to mean more to each other.
The further I go, the more convinced I am that if I had to choose a husband, I should still prefer the one heaven has given me. His character is true, and though he's awkward, he shows me all the kindness and attention possible.
In fact, the only person at Versailles that she really disliked was the king's favorite, Madame du Barry, and that was unfortunate.
It is pitiable to see the weakness the king has for Madame du Barry, the silliest and most impertinent creature imaginable.
The Dauphine's dislike for the king's favorite soon became an affair of state. Madame du Barry upbraided the king, and the Dauphin pleaded with his wife at least to appear friendly in public. Madame du Barry insisted on a public acknowledgement. Marie absolutely refused. So Comte de Mercy was called on to write to the Empress, and Maria Theresa wrote very firmly to her daughter, telling her it was her place to be polite to anyone who enjoyed the king's favour.
The next act in the drama was played here, in the Hall of Mirrors at a great public reception, New Year's Day, 1772. The royal family moved along the lines of courtiers, stopping here and there for a word or two. When Marie Antoinette drew level with Madame du Barry, she stopped, stared straight past her and said, "There are a lot of people at Versailles today." Not much, but it was enough. Madame du Barry was satisfied. Yet Marie Antoinette felt both hurt and confused. She felt everyone had complained of her innocent fun, and yet now we were expecting her to condone open immorality. From then on, she became indifferent to the criticisms leveled at her, and in the end, this was to be dangerous.
But Madame du Barry's triumph was to be short-lived. In April 1774, the king became desperately ill. The church administered the last rites, and the king's favourite was ordered to leave court forever. The king had smallpox, so his heir was not allowed near him. A lighted candle showed he still lived.
Oh Dieu, protégez-nous.
Louis XV's grandson was now king. Overwhelmed, he felt he was too young to reign. The new monarch took the title of Louis XVI.
Majesté, votre peuple.
The country welcomed Louis as a breath of fresh air after the extravagance of his grandfather's reign. But he could never again respond to the crowd like this. His young queen was torn by doubts.
I am worried by so much popular enthusiasm. It will be impossible to please everyone in the country where their vivacity makes them want everything done in the moment.
Louis was appalled at the debts, mismanagement and lethargy that he'd inherited. He determined to put things right, if he could, and if it was not too late.
Sire, puis-je vous demander quels sont vos ordres?
Daily, he was asked what amusement or entertainment he required. Nothing, he would say, besides his morning walk in the park. The courtiers did not like the new regime, and they would say, the king did nothing today, when he'd spent the whole day working.
The power of the throne is absolute. Nothing can check it. But it must be based on justice and reason. And the people must always be allowed to advise and enlighten it.
The young queen was determined to do her best too. Each morning she got up in the state bedroom where earlier queens had lived and died and submitted to the hours-long ceremony of dressing. Every morning, Monsieur Léonard, her hairdresser, drove from Paris in his own carriage with 6 horses.
Bonjour, Monsieur Léonard. C'est le grand banquet ce soir, vous vous souvenez?
Oui, Majesté.
The styles he created for her became the talk of Europe. Each day she had to wear a different dress in the morning, afternoon and evening. She chose them from pattern books kept as carefully as state papers, and the Queen's wardrobe for the day was prepared. Maria Theresa in Vienna still scolded her daughter.
I refer to the way you are dressing your hair. They tell me that from the roots on the forehead it rises as much as 3 feet and is made higher by the addition of plumes and ribbons.
It is true that I do think a little about my dress. As to feathers in the hair, everybody wears them. It would seem extraordinary not to.
The ladies-in-waiting attended her in strict order of precedence, and every movement in the ceremony was rigidly laid down. 3 bows or curtsies when approaching or leaving the sovereign.
You know, I have always held that it is well to be in the fashion to a reasonable extent, but one should never be extravagant in one's dress. A good-looking queen endowed with charm has no need of such follies. Since as queen you set the tone, all the world will hasten to follow you even when you stray into wrong paths. But I, who love my little queen, cannot hesitate to warn her of her frivolity in this matter.
All her life, Marie Antoinette had been told it was the duty of a queen to look nice and lead fashion, to be a patron of music and art, support her husband, and provide an heir to the throne. No one told her that times were changing. Only her mother dreaded to think what might lie ahead.
I cannot keep silent, for I love you too heartily to flatter you. Do not forfeit through extravagance the good name you began with. Everyone knows the king is extremely modest in his expenditure, so the whole blame will rest on your shoulders. I hope I shall not live to see the disaster that could happen.
She ordered more than 150 new dresses each year from fashion models prepared by her dressmaker, Rose Bertin. Madame Bertin had a shop in Paris and made a fortune out of the Queen's custom.
Peut-être préféreriez-vous celui-ci? Ah oui, très bien. Alors ce dessin-là, mais alors dans cette couleur? Oui, Majesté. Très bien.
While the king immersed himself in affairs of state, the Queen's problem was how to fill her days. Court etiquette made no provision for the Queen to see her husband informally.
Oui, révérende mère.
Sire, les religieuses de mon couvent souhaitent féliciter votre majesté.
It was easier for a sister of charity to have an audience with the king.
Et lui demander respectueusement.
Révérende mère, je vous suis reconnaissant.
Voilà, c'est moi. Ce stratagème était l'unique moyen de parvenir jusqu'à vous. Comment trouvez-vous ma robe?
Vous êtes ravissante, madame. M'aimez-vous?
Oh oui, sire.
Louis, serious and quiet, always adored her liveliness, and she had the greatest respect for his solid worth.
J'ai un cadeau pour vous.
Un cadeau? Qu'est-ce que c'est?
Louis gave her a mysterious present.
C'est pourquoi? Pas d'étiquette?
Pas d'étiquette.
The king's present to the queen was a house in the gardens of Versailles called the Petit Trianon. It was a doll's house compared with the vast official palace. The Petit Trianon was the traditional retreat of the king's favorite, and that was why Louis gave it to Marie Antoinette. She adored it. It was all hers and not part of the official palace, so that at last she was free of the cramping court etiquette. Here she could do what she liked, wear what she liked, and only invite the few young people she thought of as friends. Count Axel de Fersen from Sweden was a true friend who was devoted to her for the rest of her life. Madame Etiquette was replaced as lady-in-waiting by the sweet and sensitive Princesse de Lamballe. In Paris, dissidents began to write malicious little pamphlets accusing her of extravagance and asking what the Queen was getting up to in her secret hideaway. Some of them found their way to Versailles. Cartoons accused the court of being greedy monsters draining the lifeblood of the country. But the King and Queen didn't take them seriously.
Rien.
Marie Antoinette had this exquisite theatre built so that she could put on plays for a select audience. Of course, she always wanted to play in them herself, taking the parts of serving girls and ladies' maids. Naturally enough, her critics thought this was scandalous. The Queen of France, an actress.
To escape her critics and to get even further away from the life of the court, she planned her own little village, the Hameau. Here she was a simple country girl, though her simple life was only a game of let's pretend and nothing like the hard life that real peasants led all over France. When she took off her extravagant court clothes and appeared in simple muslin, people said she would ruin all the silk factories by making their wares unfashionable. When she played at being a milkmaid, the cows were brushed and groomed beforehand, and she milked them into pails of finest porcelain. Perhaps for the first time in her life, she was entirely happy, because after 8 years of marriage, she was expecting her first child. She found that even this was a public ceremony at Versailles. Not only the court, but any French citizen had the right to see that the Queen really produced an heir to the throne. 130 people crowded round her bed. Choking and breathless, she felt she would die from lack of air. The king himself came to her rescue.
Elle ne peut pas respirer. De l'air.
It was only a girl, but the country was overjoyed. It would be a boy next time. The little princess was called Marie-Thérèse after Marie Antoinette's own mother. The Queen spent far more time with her baby daughter than etiquette allowed, and with the King's sister, Madame Elisabeth, who was 10 years younger than she was. The letters to the Empress in Vienna were full of stories about the child.
I want to tell you, my dear Maman, about the happiness I had 4 days ago. There were several ladies in the nursery, and I got one of them to ask my baby which was her mother. With no prompting, the poor little thing smiled at me and put her arms around me. It's the first time she has shown she recognizes me. It was a great joy, and since then I think I love her more than ever.
At last, 3 years later, a son was born. This time, Louis put his foot down and the public were not admitted. The king himself proudly brought his son, the new Dauphin, back to be welcomed by his mother.
Le Dauphin exige audience.
Le Dauphin est le bienvenu.
Now she'd done everything that was expected of her. The Queen felt everyone would be satisfied. In fact, her first son died when he was only 8 years old, but by then she had another son who became the Dauphin Louis Charles. And so, at 28 years of age, Marie Antoinette was happy and ready to take on at last her responsibilities. But it was too late. Times were changing. France wanted a different kind of government, a new kind of monarchy. The king was still thought of as the father of his country. Of course, it wasn't his fault if things went wrong, but there was a great deal wrong with France. High prices, social injustice, food shortage. So whose fault was it? Well, everyone. The old courtiers, the middle classes, the hungry peasants began to put the blame on the Queen. They called her the foreigner, l'Autrichienne, the Austrian bitch who was coming between the king and his country. She was Madame Deficit, who frittered away the country's money. It all came to a head in the affair of the diamond necklace.
Marie, c'est Monsieur Beaumer.
Majesté.
Monsieur Beaumer?
The court jeweler, Monsieur Beaumer, had made it at vast expense for Madame du Barry. And when she left court, he tried desperately for 10 years to get the Queen to buy it. But she was adamant.
C'est élégant, n'est-ce pas?
C'était fait pour Madame du Barry.
Well, that was by no means the end of the story of the diamond necklace. Some court hangers-on managed to forge the Queen's signature agreeing to buy the necklace, and then were able to get it from the jeweller. They broke it up and sold it abroad. Of course, when the jeweller presented his bill to the Queen, she knew nothing at all about it. Well, the criminals were tracked down and brought to trial, but no one, apart from the King, believed the Queen's story. People seemed to feel that she'd been ready when the country was near to bankruptcy to squander a fortune on her own finery. And then, to avoid the scandal and to avoid paying for the necklace, she'd concocted these lies to throw the blame on innocent people. Well, the whole affair really shows up the corruption of the court and just how deep the gulf was between it and the country. But even worse, I think, is it showed just how ready people were to believe anything, however disgraceful, about the Queen. France was plunged into deeper and deeper trouble.
As a last hope, Louis summoned the Estates General, the only representative institution France possessed. It had not met for 170 years. It was too late. Members insisted on getting rid of the ancient autocratic monarchy. They demanded parliamentary government for France. All over the country, citizens formed a national guard, a people's army against the monarchy, the nobility, and the church. In Paris, townspeople demanded work and cheaper food. They talked about the will of the people. On July the 14th, 1789, the mob stormed the Bastille. This prison was the hated symbol of royal power. They destroyed it. This was war. There could be no turning back.
Elle ne put souffrir les bonnes qualités de cette jeune enfant qui rendait ses filles encore plus haïssables.
For the family at Versailles, life continued almost normally. Louis had hoped to win over the people by making concessions and by setting up a parliament in the English style. Then events overwhelmed him.
Majesté, un courrier urgent.
Oui.
De Paris.
C'est une révolte.
Non, sire. C'est une révolution.
In Paris, angry crowds urged on by political agitators marched on Versailles demanding bread. Power was slipping away to the people. Clocks were chiming away the last hours in the life of Versailles. It was October, and already several courtiers and members of the royal family had fled. The King and Queen stayed on. Later that day, the mob stormed the gates.
Sire, il semble que tout Paris soit venu ici pour vous demander du pain. Vous dites qu'il demande du pain, pauvres gens, si j'en avais à leur donner...
When the king was told, he retorted that if he'd had enough bread for everyone, he would have given it to them without their having to come and ask for it. At the Trianon, the Queen was unaware of the threatening crowds.
Majesté! Écoutez! Majesté!
But in the palace, everyone realized the mob hated the Queen so much she was in terrible danger.
Majesté! Le roi est en danger!
She was told that a carriage was waiting to take her to safety, but she refused to run away if the king was in danger. She hurried back to the palace. She was never to see the little Trianon or her little farm again. The story's been told for nearly 200 years that when she heard the women demanding bread, she laughed and said, "Can't they eat cake?" It's almost certainly not true, but it shows how everyone was ready to believe the worst about her. As night fell, the king sent out all the food there was in the palace, but the women did not go away. During the darkness, the 7,000 women who'd marched from Paris were joined by 20,000 men of the National Guard. All night long, agitators inflamed the crowd, while the king and queen got what rest they could. As dawn broke, the mob stormed the palace. They cut down the royal guard, stuck their heads on spikes and burst in. They were clamoring for the Queen. They would find her and kill her.
C'est fermé! Ouvrez! Au nom de la reine! Ouvrez!
She escaped, and hours later, as the fury of the mob died down, the shattered family gathered together. The king had been forced to promise to leave Versailles and go back to Paris with the crowd.
Nous partons pour Paris. Immédiatement.
So, for the first time for more than a century, the King of France would be established in Paris. The crowd thought this would mean that bread would immediately become cheap and plentiful in the Paris bakeries, and the baker-in-chief would give them all the bread they wanted. The Dauphin kept saying he was hungry.
Maman, j'ai faim! Prenez patience, mon
The Queen tried to soothe him. The King entrusted the court chamberlain with the care of
Nous partons
Versailles.
pour Paris, je vous fais confiance. Sauvez mon pauvre Versailles. Pour moi.
C'est vraiment dramatique, mais ça ne durera pas. Je suis sûr que vous reviendrez bientôt.
The chamberlain was certain they would return, but the French monarchy had left Versailles forever. The revolution hurtled on its course, faster and faster. A new slogan was posted everywhere: liberty, equality, fraternity, or death. Everything from former days was swept aside. The king was deposed and a republic set up. And to destroy all the enemies of the new republic, a new form of execution was invented and set up in the heart of Paris. It was called the guillotine. The royal family were kept here in the temple as prisoners, but the republic had no use for its former king. Louis was put on trial and condemned to death. At the last, his greatest concern was for his wife.
I beg my wife to forgive me for all the ills she is suffering because of me, and the griefs I may have caused her during our marriage. Poor woman. She was promised a throne, and it has come to this.
After the king's death, there was no one to protect the queen, the most hated woman in France. For 6 months, she was left with her children and with Madame Elisabeth, who had been a tower of strength to her. Then she was brought here to the prison of the Conciergerie, where prisoners were kept waiting trial and execution. Just a month before, soldiers had burst in one night and dragged her son, the 8-year-old heir to the throne, from her arms. For days she heard him crying. Then the crying had stopped. She dreaded to think what would happen to Elisabeth and Marie-Thérèse at the hands of the soldiers.
God himself has forsaken me. I no longer dare to pray.
She spent the last 2 months of her life here. Guards watched her day and night so that she never had a moment's privacy. She was utterly without hope, knowing her enemies intended her death. Night seemed endless, for she was never allowed a light. Suddenly, one evening, soldiers dragged her from her cell to be questioned by her prosecutors.
Levez-vous.
She was accused of squandering the people's money on her own amusement, of sending money from France to Austria. She'd persuaded the king to commit treason. She'd turned the Trianon into a place of vice and evil living. The public show trial started next morning and lasted for 2 days. The crowd gasped to see how she'd aged in the few months since the king's death. She was only 37. As she waited for the verdict, she knew that she'd been found guilty before the trial began. She was asked if she had anything to say.
Je ne suis pas coupable.
She was condemned to die the next morning on the guillotine.
It is to you, my dear sister Elizabeth, that I am writing for the last time. I have just been sentenced to death, but not a shameful one, since this death is shameful only to criminals, whereas I am going to rejoin your brother. Innocent, like him, I hope I shall show the firmness which he showed during his last moments. I am calm, though deeply grieved at having to forsake my poor children.
The letter was never delivered. The next morning, she tried to get herself ready. A serving woman from the prison helped her.
Au nom de la pudeur.
Woman. Venez.
The Queen braced herself to die bravely as the King had done. But the King was taken to his death in a closed carriage with a priest beside him reading the prayers for the dying. His widow had to ride in an open farm cart through streets lined with jeering ranks of her triumphant enemies. The journey took an hour. When she arrived, she had to be helped from the cart and slowly climbed the ladder to the guillotine.
It happened here, right where I'm standing. After a few moments, the executioner held up her head for the crowd to see. Well, this square was once called the Place de la Révolution. It's now known as the Place de la Concorde. And the guillotine remained here for a whole year after the Queen's death, in a time that came to be known as the Reign of Terror. Many people that the Queen had known died here after her. Madame Elisabeth, Madame Etiquette, Madame du Barry. When Axel de Fersen, who'd known her in her happier days, heard of Marie Antoinette's death, he wrote,
"The Queen's face follows me wherever I go. Her suffering and death and all my feelings never leave me for a moment. I can think of nothing else. It fills me with horror that she was alone in her last moments, with no one to comfort her or talk to her, with no one to whom she could give her last wishes."